Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to another installment of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. The voice you are hearing is of one Evan Buck, and today I am taking the two-seater edition of the What If Machine out for another spin. Here with me to accompany me on Mr. Buck's wild ride is my co-host for today, Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people.
There was a slight delay there. I was a little worried that he was going to take a little more time, but now that we have introduced ourselves, and of course, I have to say my little signature.
I was wondering how you're going to work that in.
Yes, exactly. Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan. So with both of our signature intros out of the way, we are going to delve right into today's subject matter. And we're going back to Russia, actually. We, not to date this too much, but we did recently discuss the Lenin assassination on the show. And so we're going to be fast forwarding a few decades from that point in time, from the beginning of the Soviet Union. Now we're taking a look at the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of what we now know today as the Russian Federation. And the reason this topic came up was because I actually had a discussion with somebody recently on a trip I took to Lake Tahoe, and he posited this suggestion for me. I'll let Chris get into the specifics on it, though. So, Chris, how about you take it from here?
So, well, you finish the question that set this up, because basically it was one of those. He came. We have our discussions. Evan comes in with, "Hey, what if?" Well, go ahead and do the question.
Yeah. So basically essentially what the question came down to, because some of these topics that I receive from my friends who, maybe listen to the show on and off, or some of my friends and other listeners who do it like religiously listen to the show, they sometimes posit this topic to me, and they may or may not get the full understanding of exactly how we approach things on the show, but I still give them credit and where credit is due. And then maybe Chris and I and Dylan and Kai and whoever's on the show can actually like tailor it to fit more of the fork in time model. But be that as it may, the topic that he gave me was basically, what if after the USSR dissolved in 1991, what if the Soviets went to a style of oligarchic, mafia-like capitalism? That's basically how he phrased the question. That's how he posited it to me. We were having an extensive discussion out on the hotel deck overlooking Lake Tahoe, and I described to him the premise of this podcast, and he's like, "Okay, well, how about this one? Why don't you guys cover this and see where it goes?" Now, the issue with this, of course, is that there isn't really a specific divergence point. There isn't a fork in time that was proposed outside of a rather broad, after the Soviet Union collapses, this is what they end up going to. And when I initially proposed this to my fellow co-hosts, I was like, one can argue that this was kind of what ended up happening to a certain degree in our timeline, but the implication is that this is the system that persisted until, probably close to, if not the modern day, because there are some things that we will discuss later on in this episode of why this sort of oligarchic, chaotic, heavy air quotes, free market system did not end up persisting in our timeline. So, all right, Chris, now I'll throw the football back to you, and hopefully I set that up a little bit better for you to be able to take it to the goal line.
Yeah, I mean, basically the question is, what if there's no Putin?
That's really what it comes down to. Yeah.
And we kind of had to work backwards from that, and we came up with what I think is what's gonna be a in-depth, to me, interesting fork. So the other reason I threw it to Evan to kind of bring his personal like interactions into this is because talking off podcast, I really came to realize how much of like the important moments of this I have very strong memories of. Um, so and also just like to most Americans, like the Berlin Wall came down and there's automatically like democracy in Russia. And then Putin comes in. Like that's how people understand it. They don't understand that like that's basically a decade between the fall of the wall in November of 89 and Putin being appointed prime minister / the next president.
There's a lot of things that happen in that decade that is not very well taught and discussed. And I think there's a reason behind that, which I think we'll get into. But yeah, it's not taught super well. And Chris has a lot of important, like personal perspective on this that we were able to discuss in the pre-podcast. I also have some perspective on this as well, not as due to my age. I'm a young kid, basically. I'm a young pup. So like when these things were happening, I was either not born yet or like in diapers, 3 years old, 4 years old. I did a lot of research on this during my first year ever of debate, actually. When I did team policy debate in high school, the resolution or the topic for the year was the United States federal government should substantially change its policy towards Russia. This was going on in, I think, like 2008, 2009 timeframe when I started doing debate. So like but even then, my understanding was somewhat limited compared to
0809, Putin's in power a decade and is at the end of his consolidation period.
Yes, exactly. And like, the war in Georgia, like had already happened, like a lot had already happened by that point that we were discussing in team policy debate. Stuff that happened in the 90s, I maybe knew very tangentially and maybe knew some names, but like even for the research for this podcast, I did a lot of work digging up some long dead things and overturning rocks, and it was an interesting deep dive, I'll tell you that much.
So to kind of start the timeline, November of 89 is when the Berlin Wall is opened up. That's kind of the first big crack. And what that, let me start with the personal memory of it. Only time my father ever sat down and watched the news in his IBM suit. You were not allowed to speak to him until he had gotten out of his work clothes. He would go into the bedroom, change immediately, and come back out, and then you could, but you were not to delay him. The only time he stopped was November of 89, when Peter Jennings was reporting from Berlin, the wall's coming down, and my mother is on the phone to her German refugee grandmother talking about Germany reuniting.
Wow.
Right?
That's amazing. I went to the Reagan Library and the Reagan Ranch, and at the Reagan Library, if you've been there, there is a giant hunk of the Berlin Wall. And it's one thing learning about it and reading about it in history class, and it's another thing to actually go and see a piece of the Berlin Wall and put your hand on it. And I took a selfie with it. And I remember as a teenager, I was basically like, hey, look, the irony of me as an American teenager taking a selfie with a symbol of tyranny and division, right? And I'm now here just in America, like doing something that holding a magical little iPhone in my hand that, nobody would have access to at that point. It's just the irony really struck me at that point. So I still have that photo up on my personal Instagram. So,
and the thing is, what does that mean? What does the fall of the wall mean? What the fall of the wall means is the Soviet Union withdraws from the Warsaw Pact satellites. Eastern Europe, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. But the Soviet Union is still a thing.
Still around.
Still a thing.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Gorbachev is still in power in the Soviet Union. And he is, at this point, glasnost and perestroika are well underway. Perestroika being economic reforms, glasnost being political reforms. Gorbachev was a reformer. He very much was. But he was still a communist and wanted the Soviet Union to be propelled into what he saw as the 21st century with much more streamlined, efficient, reformed government, those sorts of things. You think of the spectrum of Stalin to Gorbachev, like Gorbachev was a completely different kind of Soviet leader. And that being said, he did not want the Soviet Union to collapse. He didn't want it to fall. He was trying through his reforms to strengthen the Soviet system. Kind of like how, China in our timeline had a lot of reforms after like Mao Zedong, but they're still communist, maybe in name only, maybe because it's more like under China, you have, what I would call state capitalism today, very heavily managed capitalism, but it's still like communism in formal name, and it's a very authoritarian government. Gorbachev wanted something similar. And we actually kind of discussed some of these themes in the podcast that we did on Zhao Ziyang, where we basically said, look, China saw what happened to what Russia did. They tried to achieve both political and economic reforms at the same time, and it led to the whole collapse of the whole system. So in that podcast, we argued China is probably only going to do some incremental political reforms and keep a pretty tight clamp on the economic side. So anyway, I digress. That was a little bit of a divergence there.
So Soviet Union still exists. For most of you, I think another point of this would be, for example, the first Gulf War. Soviet Union still existed during the first Gulf War. And it's teetering along. There's a lot of independence movements in the republics. Ukraine, you know what? Let me say the Baltics. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are very important in it. They were there because these countries were countries. They were independent states between the fall of the Russian Empire, or after the fall of the Russian Empire. They were taken over during World War II and never left, but they still had been independent countries.
They're their own people. They have their own culture, their own language. They're not Russians.
Right. Ukraine is huge and is very important to Russia. And when basically the Baltics are trying to break away, but Ukraine is kind of what breaks the Soviet Union. In August of 1991, the hardliners try and step in Moscow. They mount a coup against Gorbachev and try and kick him out. The only reason, they take over they take over the state television. It's not very well planned, because rather than walking in with like a videotape and handing them the tape and saying, hey, here is our official pronouncement, they take over the state radio and start playing Swan Lake. And once they've taken over, then they put out their press conference about, hey, we're in charge now, all this other stuff. That fails completely. But what winds up happening is the leaders of I'm going to call them the provinces or the states, because what turns into completely
the individual socialist republics at that point, and they end up becoming their own states.
Right. Yeltsin is the most important, but the probably second most important is probably Ukraine, because it is so powerful within the organization. They oppose the coup, but they also oppose Gorbachev. So these groups get together and come up with an agreement that we're going to dissolve the entire Soviet Union. They don't even consult Gorbachev.
Yeah, Gorbachev is like in the background, basically like old man yells at cloud from The
Yep.
Simpsons. He's like, no, and he can't do anything about it.
And in December of 1991, as I'm getting home from Christmas vacation, from going up to Richmond to see the refugee grandmother again, we turn on the news and there's an image of the Soviet flag being lowered for the last time over the Kremlin.
Yep.
So
And the
there were
Russian
two.
tricolor and the Russian tricolor comes up, and the Russian tricolor was used by like the Yeltsinists and
Yep.
all of that to basically go. They're proposing like the Russian Federation, and so that leads to essentially Gorbachev starring in a Pizza Hut commercial.
Yep.
I promised one of the co-hosts who couldn't be here today, Kai, that I would make reference to that. I've made good on that promise.
And I forget what it was, but it's basically it's amazing. It's normal Russians debating whether Gorbachev was good or bad for the country.
Yeah, it's actually a really funny, amazing commercial. If you haven't seen it, you should see it.
Show notes.
Show notes. Pop it in.
Yeltsin is now in charge of the Russian Federation.
Yep.
I didn't even talk about this earlier, but are you familiar, Guy, with the Sum of All Fears, the Tom Clancy movie?
I've heard of it.
Okay, if you've seen it, okay, that's another personal time we don't need to talk about. I might have gone to see the Sum of All Fears as one of the first dates I ever went on. It just keeps coming back into my life.
Interesting
this story. This episode is the story of my life.
It's the Chris Coppola life story show.
This movie and you know basically what it talks about, or what happens in it. It talks about a drunk Russian president who everybody knows no longer matters, and all of the machinations behind the scenes as to who's the next person's going to be. And I think that's the bulk of what this episode's about. Yeltsin has a drinking problem. He's seen like he's gone, he's not checked in. He supports nominal westernization, liberalization, democratization, all of these things that Americans are telling him like he wants to do. It's not really taking hold. In 1996, he's up for another reelection. The United States and the entire West, like the industry of Western political consultants, floods into Russia and props him up to a large extent.
I mean, if you want to talk about like with modern politics and allegations of Russian interference in American elections, that might be a big deal, and a big reason why this happens is because in our own timeline, we basically had the exact opposite happen in the 90s, where it was blatant. We had just very blatant American meddling in the Russian election. Because as I note in my document that I wrote up for, and the research I indicated, that indicates this, there was so much chaos and power vacuums and lack of, strong, stable leadership in the Yeltsin administration. Yeltsin was very effective at smashing things, at, coming in and obliterating his opposition. He was not a good builder. He was not good at governance. And that was just not his skill set. So you essentially have an election in 96 where most of the Russian population is looking at what is going on with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they're looking around, they're looking at themselves, and they're looking at Yeltsin, and they're like, look, hey, maybe communism wasn't all that great, but it was at least stable. It was at least something that we could count on. from day to day. We don't know what's going on from one day to the next in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was significant support for the communist candidate, Gennady Zyuganov, in the 96 election.
Gennady Zyuganov.
I can't pronounce these Russian names. Yes.
and you're always going to be able to tell when he springs a new name on me, because free podcast, we did have several discussions about how to pronounce different names. So
yes,
name I haven't heard about yet, that's how you can tell. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So I apologize in advance to any listeners who are Russian or who have familiarity with Russian, because I will probably butcher it and Chris will probably correct me on it. But anyway, so, the Communist Party has a strong showing to the point where they force a runoff in the 96 election. This is the only election in Russian history as a free, quote unquote, democratic country that has been forced into a runoff. And Yeltsin wins pretty convincingly, more likely than not, because most all Western governments put their thumb on the scale and say, yeah, as incompetent as this guy is, we have to keep him around because the alternative is Cold War II electric boogaloo.
So another election, this is election season in Russia, just like here. Several different elections happen at the same time. One of the other elections that happened in 96 was for mayor of St. Petersburg. And here's why I'm talking about this, because it plays into what's about to happen. The mayor of St. Petersburg going into that election was Walter Sobchak. Yes, by the way, that has to be the episode art for this.
Oh yes. I know what you're saying.
Yeah. A Venn diagram of people that understand mid-90s Russian politics and are fans of The Big Lebowski.
Exactly. Yes.
At this point, Walter Sobchak is the mayor of St. Petersburg. Nobody else knows who this guy is, but the important thing is he kind of loses and is almost immediately brought up on corruption charges. But the important thing is who his deputy mayor was. Who is his deputy mayor?
One of two deputy mayors, actually, but I don't even know who the other guy is because he's not important to this story. The deputy mayor that I'm talking about is Vladimir Putin.
So, okay, yeah, he's a little bit further in life, but like this might be Chris and Vladimir Putin's parallel lives telling the story of this pot. Because he was a KGB officer in Germany in 89 when the wall comes down, and like he's trying to get orders what to do, and Moscow isn't answering. So he can't do anything to stop the fall of East Germany. All Russian troops are evacuated from Central Europe, and he basically gets a job as the as a political person, fixer, deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. And is working for Walter Sobchak, who loses the 96 election. This is what kind of sets Putin up for in our timeline, because after this, some of his friends from the KGB bring him to Moscow, have him start working for the FSB, the new KGB, the Russian security services, so that he's in Moscow in 99 when there's a long series of prime ministers going through, and basically Putin, like the first anybody in the West knew who Putin was almost in August of 99 when he's appointed as prime minister by Boris Yeltsin, and it becomes very clear that he's the next one.
He basically came almost out of nowhere, because when you consider Putin's career before this point, he was a KGB officer who then became deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, most likely because he had material from the KGB to blackmail the mayor of St. Petersburg.
Because as a KGB if you look at Putin's history as a KGB officer, before he got posted to Dresden in Germany, he was responsible for activities in St. Petersburg.
Which was known at that point as Leningrad.
He basically was a Leningrad guy. He had been born in Leningrad. He was a kind of a street tough in post-war Leningrad. And once he finally got to be a KGB officer, he's responsible for monitoring foreigners and Soviet people in contact with foreigners in Leningrad. So that's his home. And it's really important to understand that for what's about to come.
Exactly. So in our timeline, we have Putin essentially going over to Moscow, being brought in, hired by the Yeltsin administration. And he is essentially one of several possible candidates that Yeltsin is looking at to replace him, as Yeltsin is considering to, resign because he's out of it. He doesn't.
I feel like you're giving Yeltsin a lot of credit that he doesn't deserve.
Not honestly, not really.
It's not Yeltsin being. Very rarely in history will you look at anybody, like any political leader, confronting their own mortality.
Yeah.
No political leader reflects on their own mortality and is like, I don't have many years left. Never.
No.
This is more everybody, like, this is the people who, like, have to clean up after Yeltsin throws up on the presidential desk, being like, yeah, he doesn't have a whole lot left in him, does he?
Exactly. I mean, let's put it this way. Yeltsin we know of as a nominally pro-Western guy. This is also the same Yeltsin that literally shelled the parliament building in 92, 93 during the constitutional crisis because there were one too many communists there who disagreed with him. Fast forward to 99, and you have somebody who is barely, even keeping it together.
This is also the same Yeltsin that during a state visit to Washington, D.C., was discovered wandering the streets of Washington drunk and naked looking for pizza. Not kidding.
And you know what? Maybe they should have ran a Yeltsin Pizza Hut ad too for that reason. That would have been even better than the Gorbachev ad.
That requires admitting that story.
It does, though. It does. So anyway. So Putin in our timeline, in the canonical timeline, as Kai likes to say it, is in the right place at the right time and is able to take over the reins when Yeltsin resigns. In the alternate timeline that we're creating, Putin does not go to Moscow. He, as a St. Petersburg guy, decides that it'd be more profitable for him and his future career interests to stick around and see what might happen for him after the fact. Now, how specifically Putin's career diverges and differs from this point is not going to be the main focus of this podcast. We personally think, Chris and I kind of talked about this a little bit. We think he might either end up becoming some kind of local St. Pete fixer kind of guy, able to exert influence kind of as a behind the scenes sort of shadowy kind of person. I also personally think that he maybe sometime in the future could stage a run for St. Petersburg mayor himself. I do think it's too soon in the immediate aftermath of his boss losing, because his boss wasn't really exactly known as a super well-liked, competent guy either. So, but Putin could eventually, with enough time, enough distance, just kind of be like, yeah, you know what? My boss wasn't all that great. I was the deputy mayor when this all happened. I would have done things differently. Vote for me. And he could have done that too. But either way, it's a very plausible idea that Putin would not go and join his friends in Moscow. So that's the focus of our podcast today, is no Moscow Putin. We have a St. Pete Putin, and who instead would take Putin's place and really in the alternate timeline, Yeltsin's place, because Putin is a non-entity, right? He's just a local, he would always be known as a historical footnote, as he was the mayor of St. Petersburg or some St. Petersburg fixer. Nobody in the West would really even know who Putin was. So in the alternate timeline, we have a couple of ideas of who might be the man in charge after Yeltsin resigns. And I'll introduce my idea of who that might be, and Chris can get into his idea of who he thinks is going to be the guy who takes charge. So when I did research, I was looking around at some different articles. I found a couple of articles. One from the BBC that actually was an interview with Yeltsin's, I think it was his chief of staff, and he was talking about, from his point of view, like the deliberations about, hey, Yeltsin, who's going to take charge once you resign? And Putin's name, of course, came up, and it was actually the chief of staff who basically first suggested Putin. He hired Putin into the Yeltsin administration himself. So like, he was very familiar with Putin, very impressed with him. And arguably, it's this chief of staff that is probably who elevated Putin to begin with.
All of the thing you were saying, Yeltsin's doing this, Yeltsin's doing that. This is probably
It's really
actually.
Yes, yeah. This is the guy who is actually probably making the decision for Yeltsin. Anyway, there's another couple names that were brought up in this article as well. And I'm going to talk about the first name that comes up in this list of possible names. And that's a man by the name of Boris Nemtsov. Now, Nemtsov is an interesting candidate to me because he was appointed by Yeltsin to the governorship of a pretty important province. I think it's pretty close to Moscow, geographically speaking. And Nemtsov in our timeline is known as a very pro-Western, pro-liberalization, anti-Putin kind of guy. He ended up being assassinated in our own timeline, I think around like 2010 or 2015 timeframe. So to me, he makes for a very interesting choice. He was also the Minister of Fuel and Energy and the Vice Premier of Russia and a Security Council member. So I think he stands a pretty decent chance of being nominated if Putin is not in the picture, because he does have some ties to, energy companies, fuel companies. We kind of neglected to mention this in the construction of the alternate of what happened, our timeline, but Yeltsin was very much financed by a very powerful cabal of oligarchs in the Soviet Union, or in the former Soviet Union, that they were basically first in line after the Soviet Union collapsed to acquire a lot of what were previously state-owned assets. So Yeltsin engaged in a scheme. I think what was it, like the loans for what was that called? Loans for something scheme. I'm forgetting the name of it. The loans for shares. Yeah, loans for shares. So basically what was going on here was the Russian treasury was almost broke. So Yeltsin was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to sell some of what we own, state-owned assets, to my buddies. And their dollars in exchange, and the Russian government will still have some ownership in these companies, but they'll be, privately owned enterprises now in exchange for immediate cash in the Russian treasury because we're almost broke. So the oligarchs heavily funded Yeltsin's 96 campaign. And so I think Nemtsov stands a decent chance of being the one who becomes that guy, because he aligns with Yeltsin's, nominally Western liberalization ideas. Even though Nemtsov, I would say, is much more blatantly pro-Western than Yeltsin ever was. But he has some credentials. He has some working relationships. He probably has some working relationships with the oligarchs that Yeltsin is also very much wanting to keep on his good side. And he's just, in my view, if there's no Putin, I think Nemtsov stands a pretty good chance. There's also some literature that I found while I was, again, researching for this topic, in particular from the Hoover Institute, that does posit this fork that we're discussing of what if there was no Putin. And they argued that Nemtsov would have most likely been the next Russian president. So that's my proposal. I think Chris is a very interesting secondary proposal, though. Why don't you get into that?
Sure. Victor Cheminirkin. And yes, this was definitely one of the names that we went over. Chernomyrdin was the Soviet minister for natural gas during the transition. And right afterwards, as soon as kind of the Russian Federation Constitution comes into force, he's one of the first prime ministers. He is in power as prime minister, also having come out of the natural gas ministry during not just natural gas, but all of the basically denationalization, all of the privatization, and probably had a pretty big role in deciding who found out about a lot of the auctions for cut rate resources. Like, they weren't necessarily publicly, you couldn't necessarily look up and see when these things would be auctioned off, but if you had the right friends, you very quickly got.
If you knew a guy who knew a guy, it's not necessarily what you know, it's who you know in these scenarios.
And I think that means he's got a lot of connections to these Russian oligarchs who are very powerful people. And I think basically what wound up happening in 98, there was the Asian financial crisis, and that kind of triggered a run on a lot of capital in developing markets, and people at this point considered Russia a developing market. It led to a run on their financial system, and he was forced out. If he's not forced out and he's kept in, he's got support from economically powerful people, and you're never in a situation. The chief of staff that Evan was just talking about is never even looking for another replacement. It's just Chernomyrdin. He walks into it. He's the guy until the financial crisis kicks him out. He also in 96 founded one of the predecessor parties for United Russia.
Mm-hmm. And in our own timeline, he ends up becoming a member of United Russia, which, I mean, that's not necessarily super unique because most anybody who's not an opposition candidate is in Putin's party, United Russia, but I digress. He also was acting president for Yeltsin when Yeltsin had like a heart surgery or something, I think, like that. So, he was already basically in a Putin-less timeline. He is probably the most likely positionally sort of person to ascend to the presidency. So I think with both of these candidates put forward, Chris and I had a discussion about this because in order to have a timeline move forward, we have to pick one of them. And while I do think that Yeltsin would like Nemtsov in the role, I do think that, and something else to keep in mind as well about Chernomyrdin is he was the founder of a very important state-owned company, Gazprom. I think there's just too many connections there. And I think there's just really too much in terms of the pure credentials going for Chernomyrdin for him to be passed over. So I think in December 31st, 1999, in the alternate timeline, instead of Putin ascending to the presidency, we have Chernomyrdin. So we transition from Yeltsin's Russia. I'm putting that in heavy air quotes because, again, let's be real, he wasn't the one running the show. We transitioned from formerly Yeltsin's Russia to Chernomyrdin's Russia. What do you think is Chernomyrdin's biggest priorities at this particular time? I'll just throw out right now, something big that we discussed in the pre-podcast was an event that astute Russian history historians will be very familiar with going on at this point in time, and that's the Second Chechen War. The First Chechen War was actually, interestingly enough, a lot of it was handled because, again, Yeltsin was out a lot of the time. He wasn't really handling things. Chernomyrdin was one of the main guys who helped negotiate, hostage releases and everything in the First Chechen War. So Chris had a very interesting point about the Second Chechen War, because in our timeline, we have this, kind of the rumblings of the start of the Second Chechen War happening in August of 99. In our timeline, who ascends to the prime ministership in August of 99? Vladimir Putin.
We're having the discussion, and Evan's like, oh, I'm seeing these it's kind of started with these apartment bombings. And I was like, yeah, when were they? I'm like, well, I'm not like, they're like 2 weeks after Putin takes over. And not only are they 2 weeks after Putin takes over, if you look and again, you know what? This just reminded me, this is a lot like, I'm thinking a lot of comparing it to kind of like the Reichstag fire, where like,
oh my gosh, yeah.
Right?
No, exactly. No, that's like a very good comparison point for this. For those who are unfamiliar, basically, pretty much most all the evidence blatantly shows and suggests that these apartment bombings, which are used as a justification for the Russians to get involved again in Chechnya. Chechnya, for those who aren't familiar, is a semi-autonomous area of Russia in the northern Caucasus region, I believe. They're majority Muslim, have a very strong independent streak about them, and they fought, two civil wars essentially against the Russian state in the 90s, early 2000s, trying to break away. In our timeline, now they are pretty closely tied to Russia and to Putin, because Putin, as a strongman kind of actor, he basically took care of business. We'll just put it that way, with planning the false flag operation, with the apartment bombings, and then crushing the resistance there. It's just, the first time I saw this, Chris, the first time I saw the leader of Chechnya essentially having a press conference with Putin saying, yeah, we're sending troops over to Ukraine to fight alongside Russians, that was such a trip for me, because I, as a kid in middle school, actually, I wrote a paper on the Chechnyan wars. This is the kind of weird guy I was in, middle school, high school. I wrote a paper on this. So like, I was very familiar with Chechnya's history, recent history. And then seeing that guy just show up on TV with Putin and Prigozhin and all that, I'm just like, what is going on here? Like, something big happened. And well, in our timeline, we know what happened. In this timeline, in the alternate timeline, Chris, do you even think there's going to be a second Chechen war?
No. I think it's interesting to think about what Chairman is going to do, because one, as prime minister, when Yeltsin is kind of checked out, he actually negotiated with leaders in Chechnya to de-escalate and step down, and kind of started a process that led to the agreement that ended the first war, which was basically like, you new independent people can stay in charge of Chechnya. We just won't say you're an independent country, but in most terms of domestic, everything you want to do it.
Yeah.
And so he'd already kind of like negotiated the end of that. I'll tell you one thing, he's not going to start it up within 2 weeks of taking power.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what Putin did.
Yeah. And here's something else as well that we can consider is, with all of our oligarchic people like still walking the halls of power, because you have to remember, in our timeline, Putin had none of that. Putin was very much against these oligarchs exerting influence. He wanted them out, and he kicked them out. And you hear even stories up to this day about Russian oligarchs being, thrown out of hospital windows and having it being officially ruled a suicide or whatever. Well, I don't really necessarily have to fill in the blanks of what actually is going on there. But if you're a Russian oligarch today, you better be towing the line. I'll just put it that way for any Russian oligarchs who are possibly listening.
If you're a Russian oligarch still in Russia.
Yeah. Exactly.
There are and this is one of the other things that's going to change if you don't have Putin. If you have a Chairman Reardon, he comes in and co-ops and is with the oligarchs. Putin
Yes.
spends a decent amount of his time fighting and taking the power away from these people.
Yes.
Which a Chairman administration doesn't have to. And by the way, there are some that fled and lived very happy lives with their money because they just cut bait and just got out of Russia.
Mm-hmm. And there are also some of those who also cut bait, went out of Russia, enjoyed their money for a little bit until they end up poisoned or some other fate.
The people that wound up poisoned were the ones that wrote books. Were the ones that stayed involved.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I think, something that's really interesting to think about is in a Chairman Reardon administration, there's most likely no second Chechen war, or at the very least, it doesn't start 2 weeks after, he gets in.
That was
yeah, I know. That's just so crazy to me. Russia's not starting it. So he doesn't have that to deal with. He also has the oligarchs more lined up in his pocket as opposed to him actually trying to fight them or, take out ones that disagree with him. So, and this was something that I thought of and kind of put in my show notes is to a certain degree, I see Chernomyrdin mirroring and Russian history kind of somewhat mirroring Ukrainian history at this point in time. And for those who aren't familiar, a lot of what happened with Ukrainian history over the last couple decades has been, going between pro-Russian and pro-Western sorts of presidents. But the uniting common denominator between a lot of them is that they're corrupt, that they're controlled by oligarchs or are friends with them. And, it doesn't really matter who's in power in terms of the oligarchs, as long as you're friends with them.
What we're talking about are the immediate post-transition people.
Yes. Yeah.
Not the new people, not the current.
Right. Not the current administration.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Just wanted to make that clear. Because we could have a whole nother podcast talking about like what's going on in Ukraine at this time. We'll get to that here in a little bit. Because now I'm mentioning it, so it's probably as good an idea as any to start getting into it. But I kind of see in the long run, because under the Nemtsov sort of administration outlook, the Hoover Institute and a lot of other people that I've seen on the internet are like, hey, Russia could have been this great, free, wonderful, Western, liberalized society. I'm just going to say right now, under a Chernomyrdin administration, fat chance. Not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly not going to become what we see today as a very, increasingly anti-Western regime under Putin. I think it's going to, kind of try and thread a middle ground, be more neutral, in international affairs. But what we're probably more likely going to be seeing instead is basically imagine if Yeltsin was not drunk. Like imagine if Yeltsin was at least baseline competent. And that to me presents a very interesting scenario to if we have actually more stable leadership that is of that more, a little bit more liberal, a little bit more pro-Western. I think Chernomyrdin, frankly, is, from what I've read up on him, is not, as explicitly pro-Western as he is just not anti-Western, if that makes sense. But be that as it may, and like in our timeline, we basically have the communists almost come back to power because of the chaos and incompetence under the Yeltsin administration. I think Chernomyrdin does a lot to kind of help steady the ship and bring some confidence into a fledgling democratic system. Because you have to remember, the Russians as a people have dealt with thousands of years of tsardoms, communism, civil strife, civil unrest. It's baked into the Russian ethos, right? As their history. They have a long, storied, proud history. But also, if you talk to most any Russian, you understand the kind of undercurrent of, sadness, oppression, all of this. It's very evident It's very apparent whenever you talk to somebody from Russia or somebody who is Russian, understands their history very deeply. So you have to understand, we're like 5 or 6 years, well, under Yeltsin, it was like 5 or 6 years later, but we have basically just a decade of a fledgling democratic system for a people group that have been under various forms of authoritarian dictatorships or kingdoms, tsardoms, whatever, for thousands of years. And they're already wanting to go back to communism. So I think one of the biggest impacts from this is, regardless of the corruption levels or the oligarchic influences that are still happening, I do think Chernomyrdin helps bring a measure of stability and gives kind of helps. It's like when, Gerald Ford took over after Nixon, and Nixon kind of helped bring American trust in government to an all-time low. Ford, by his kind of squeaky clean image, Boy Scout image, comes in, and he's not involved in any of that nonsense that happens with Watergate and all of that.
You can't say that Chernomyrdin is not involved in any nonsense.
You can't say he's not involved in nonsense. No, you certainly can't. So that's where the analogy somewhat breaks down. But I think the point I'm trying to get across is that he helps not just restore trust in a government system. I think he brings credibility to this new experiment in Russian democracy.
He brings stability.
He brings stability. Putin,
and that's good enough.
Yeah, no, that's just good enough. Putin in our timeline, he basically starts the slow creep back into authoritarianism, which, the Russians basically wanted to go back to communism right away. And Putin basically came in and he preached at first that I'm this, kind of pro-liberalization kind of guy so that he could get appointed by Yeltsin. And then as soon as he gets in, he starts kind of slowly moving the Overton window back to where Russia is today, which is, it's a nominal democracy. But if you're not Vladimir Putin, you're not winning. If you're not for Putin's policies, you're not winning. If you speak out against Putin, you're ending up in a prison somewhere. You're gulagged, essentially. So I think it's a very interesting divergence from our timeline, the canonical timeline, is a Russia that is not authoritarian, but is actually a functioning democracy. Whether or not it's super pro-Western or
not a
actually
functioning democracy. It's not going to be a functioning democracy. It's going to be a functioning oligarchy.
Yeah, I was going to say a functioning oligarchy with democratic trappings.
And I think that's one of the better possibilities to wind up at a democratic Russia, because it provides that stability, and eventually the oligarchy is going to diffuse its power a little bit. But
I mean, again, given the extent of Russian history and what we see now in our timeline under Putin, I mean, if I was a Russian citizen, I would definitely prefer what we're creating in the alternate timeline, even if it's far from perfect and not as efficient. It's certainly far from a Stalin-esque command and control economy that just did not work at all. It's definitely a step more in the right direction, I would say. Something else that I'll also bring up here too that we can discuss a little bit is, and this is something that led to some very interesting back and forth in the pre-podcast, was the Ukraine question. Because we've mentioned Ukraine, we've thrown it out here a few times. And this is something that the listeners might have thought of as they, picked up this episode, is they're like, how would a Putinless Russia either be the same or different from our timeline when it comes to Ukraine? Because that's not to date this podcast, but at the time of this recording, it's still an ongoing conflict. It has been ongoing, actually.
Don't worry, it's going to be still ongoing for
Exactly. It'll be going on for a long time, most likely than not. I mean, it's been going on since 2014, basically, because if you go back to when they took over Crimea, that's really when the conflict has been going on, but it only became the special military operation a couple years ago. But I digress. Chris, how about you talk a little bit about what Chernomyrdin's relationship is with Ukraine? There's some very interesting historical nuggets there.
So, in our timeline, after he is passed over for prime minister and loses that office. He's appointed the Russian ambassador to Ukraine under Vladimir Putin. And I would argue one of the important things to understand about Maidan was the Orange Revolution in 2005, where there was a disputed presidential election. He basically, Chernomyrdin said, we can't do business with the current people, but maybe we'll be able to do business with the next people. Intentionally trying to put his thumbs on the scale, because basically in 2004, 2005, there was a disputed election. This was when Viktor Yanukovych was kind of the Russian candidate. Viktor Yushchenko was the pro-Western kind of break away from Russia candidate. This was one of the first dioxin poisonings. They tried to basically poison Yushchenko so that he wouldn't win. And when that didn't work, they had a very corrupt election. And by the way, this is kind of the period when we were talking about both sides in Ukraine being heavily oligarch influenced. What wound up happening looked a lot like Maidan. And what happened is people came out in the streets protesting the election. The Supreme Court threw it out. They reran it. Yushchenko takes power. 5 years later, his term's over. There's going to be another election. This is when Chernomyrdin, as ambassador, says, we can't deal with Yushchenko, but maybe we'll be able to deal with the next person. During this whole period, one of the things that the Russian Federation did to beat up on Ukraine was to say that they're not paying enough for their natural gas, for the natural gas that is being shipped across Ukraine to Europe, because Europe's a huge consumer of it, saying that the Ukrainians are tapping into this pipeline or stealing the gas, are not paying the appropriate agreed amount. And lo and behold, they do this every single fall. Right before it's about to get cold, they'll cut off the gas to Ukraine to gain leverage on the Ukrainian president. So again, going into 2009, Chernomyrdin's putting his thumb on the scale of that, saying, hey, we can do business with Yanukovych. We can't with Yushchenko. Guess what? Yanukovych winds up winning. The pro-Russian takes over. He took over as a pro-Russian and is trying to balance, and says he's talking to NATO, talking to the EU about a trade deal. This is what triggers the latest crisis. He immediately decides, you know what, I'm not going to do that deal. Let me do another deal with the Russian Federation. People don't approve of it. They come out in the streets. This is Maidan. He steps down, and that triggered the 2014 seizure of Crimea.
Yeah, and Poroshenko comes in 2014, who is, more of a pro-Western, European Union kind of candidate. And again, this is a big part of what ends up triggering. He was presiding over Ukraine and came into office when the Crimean takeover happens, when, the Russian troops go into the Donbas region. And I think it was Poroshenko, and then did Zelensky come after Poroshenko, or was there someone else in between? Yeah. So,
I think he was next.
I think, Zelensky's next, who is, again, more of this, pro-Russian or pro-Western, anti-Russian candidate. That's a big part why Putin in our timeline.
But again, he's elected while there are Russian troops in Ukraine.
Right. Exactly. And so at this point, after Maidan, after, we have two, more pro-Western Ukrainian presidents, this very much irks Putin, because in our timeline, and I forget exactly when this is, but essentially a big part of why Ukraine is Ukraine today as an independent country is because they made an agreement that said, all right, we will give up our nuclear weapons,
Mhm.
give them back, and we will not join NATO in exchange for Russia not meddling in our affairs anymore. This is what Putin alleges was a broken agreement, with Zelensky very heavily pushing for NATO membership.
Mhm.
And we're touching upon like very modern politics and modern happenings of what's going on
Well,
these days.
the point was not that it was that basically during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Russian Federation were the sites that Soviet Union nuclear weapons were based in.
Mhm.
Imagine if this were to happen in the United States, North Dakota with Minot, Louisiana with Barksdale, a couple of other places have nuclear weapons there. And the agreement, this was part of the 90s Russia of we need to make sure we know who has these. And the fewer countries that do, the better off we are. So the alleged agreement was Ukraine and Kazakhstan hasn't mattered, but point of fact, it was there. Transfer the Soviet nuclear weapons in your country to Russia, and in exchange, we agree to guarantee your borders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think in summary, under a Chernomyrdin administration, we're going to see a Russia that is, in my view, much less openly, belligerent towards Ukraine,
Mhm.
but is going to be under the surface, meddling in Ukrainian affairs
I
to
think
ensure that a more pro-Russian, or at the very least, not overtly pro-Western, candidate is going to win in Ukraine whenever Ukrainian elections happen.
I think the key thing here is what Chernomyrdin did in Chechnya.
Yeah.
He made a deal. And especially as the natural gas minister, as much as that mattered to Ukrainian-Russian relations, he's going to make a deal that will provide stability and some measure of normalcy to the Ukrainian economy. What triggered a lot of what we've seen is the conflict. And Putin takes over things. Chernomyrdin is going to be kind of a presider. He's going to be okay with other power centers as long as they bend the knee to me. He's going to be okay with oligarchs. He's going to be okay with independent states. To think about Kazakhstan, a lot of Gazprom and the nominally Soviet Russian gas comes out of Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
The thing is, there's no way to get it anywhere without going through Russian pipelines. He's going to be okay with them doing their own thing. We're going to come to some economic agreement. Your people are going to prosper. We're going to be okay. We're not going to confront, and therefore, when you confront Ukraine, when you try and hold them down, when you try and occupy Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, that's when you trigger reactions, and that's what led to a lot of the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
If you just let Ukraine develop on its own, I don't think you're not going to have the pushback and the conflict the way you do today.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. So I think there's really one more area that I personally wanted to bring up before we kind of draw this episode to a close. And this is something that means a lot to me personally, because this was an issue that was debated in my first year of high school debate. And this is something that like most average Americans have probably never heard of. And, in our timeline, it was basically repealed in 2012 under the Obama administration. But I had to suffer the horrors of this during 2008, 2009.
So go ahead and inflict it on our listeners.
So I'll just go ahead and inflict it on our listeners too. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment was a 1974 provision in essentially U.S. federal trade law. And it was thrown in by a couple of senators who basically said, hey, look, we have these, at the time of its adoption, it was basically targeted at Soviet bloc countries. So when we mentioned like the Warsaw Pact at the beginning of this episode, think not just the Soviets, but also Poland and Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, all of those countries, East Germany, east of the Iron Curtain. The senators basically said, hey, we should restrict our trade relationship with these countries that have restrictions that we don't like on freedom of immigration primarily, but also things like, basic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom, property ownership, those kinds of things. So Jackson-Vanik was basically a amendment for our trade policies that said, look, we are not going to have normal trade relations with certain countries that we disagree with, but we have a system in place for, annually we can grant nominal normal trade relationships if they help, they kind of start drawing down those policies we don't like, they start liberalizing in certain ways. And then eventually we can graduate you from the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. So basically think of it as like a bit of a blacklist, but you have a way to, get into the cool kids club. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment gave a mechanism for that. In our timeline, and this is why it was terrible for me as a debater, we kept Russia on this provision until 2012. This was long after Russia became the Russian Federation in the 90s, essentially granted full emigration rights to its citizens. And that was the original purpose of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. But we kept them on it until 2012.
I don't know the answer to this, but I know the answer to this. Where was China?
I know, exactly.
Again, I went into that not knowing what he was going to tell me, but I knew what he was going to tell me.
Yes. And I, because my extent of my relationship with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was having it being run as an affirmative case on me and me having no idea how to argue against it on the other side. Because let's be real, there really isn't a reason to not take Russia off the Jackson-Vanik Amendment when its original legislative intent was to not do extensive trade with countries that don't have good immigration policies. Well, Russia fixed that, but we kept them on it. And, a lot of the literature and evidence at the time, when you use evidence in debate, it's referred to as evidence cards. And that's because they used to write them on 3x5 cards when we had computers that went out the window. But be that as it may, a lot of, people think that we kept Russia on Jackson-Vanik because it was punitive, because the United States was like, hey, we don't like Putin. We don't like what he's doing. We're just going to keep them on this policy, which completely distorts its original intent and purpose. But we're just going to do it anyway. And I remember vividly the affirmative teams arguing that we were shifting the goalposts. We kept moving the bar for Russia to be able to graduate from this amendment. We used this as the U.S. government to pressure them to do things that we wanted them to do and to not do what we didn't want them to do. So in this alternate timeline, Chris, do we think that Jackson-Vanik is revoked earlier, possibly?
No.
Okay.
The reason I say that is in what we're talking about Russia. It kind of is now, but firmly becoming a petrostate.
Mm-hmm.
An oligarchic petrostate. And while they're okay with immigration, economic liberalization isn't going to happen. I mean, I think one of the things that Putin wound up doing, and one of the arguments around keeping a Jackson-Vanik, was what Putin did is he took the Gazprom and Rosneft and all of these other companies away from these oligarchs. While you're not going to take them away, they're going to have a very close relationship with the Russian government, so that it's not exactly kind of a integrated business enterprise into the world market. And it's also going to be used as a cudgel by the Russian Federation against other people. I think what's you're really going to be interesting is to think about and this is another episode we might want to talk about, in 2003, 2004, 2005, there's a moment where Putin is kind of reaching out to the West around the issue of what's happening in the North Caucasus. And what he is saying is, hey, we're dealing with an Islamist insurgency in our own country. We need to work together against this. And within the George W. Bush administration, some of the like Condoleezza Rice and other people had been trained to say Russians bad guys. Russians bad guys. That's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to theirs.
And I mean, I think that's a big reason why with the Obama administration, we have, the famous Hillary Clinton and Dmitry Medvedev, the giant Russian reset button, was somewhat of a repudiation of that philosophy.
They were trying to do that. That was when
it didn't work. I'll just say right now.
That was when the West came around and was like, oh, we do want to work with you on these things. By that point, the will on the other side had left.
By that point, it was too late.
But I think what's interesting is to think about what does a Russian petrostate do? How does a Russian petrostate react to what winds up being instability in the Middle East?
Yeah. That is a huge topic.
And we're looking at that, keep in mind, that is not like Denmark, Norway, and the United Kingdom North Sea oil, which is just kind of integrated into like the world market. This is a nation state controlling large shares of it, much like what happens in Saudi Arabia and Iran and these other places. But if Russia stays tied to being a petrostate and keeps very tight control of the oil industry, that makes for a lot of interesting possibilities once the instability starts.
No, it really does. And I think, just as a high level overview, because that could be a whole nother discussion, continuation of this possible timeline, part 2 that we threaten, but maybe don't actually get to, but I would be interested in it possibly as a continuation of this is, I think fundamentally at the end of this, sort of as you start kind of bring this to a close, I think what we can summarize the major changes being is we have a Russia that is not at all liberal or pro-Western, but we also don't have a Russia that is, as we see today, explicitly anti-Western and very much aligning itself with, China and Iran and North Korea in a quest to make a multipolar world. We see a Russia that is content to straddle the middle, I feel. We see a Russia that is open for business, but the business that we are talking about is really only open if you know the right people in the right places. We see a Russia that is more than open to welcoming American dollars and Western European dollars as much as they are welcome to opening and receiving, Chinese investment, Iranian investment, and working with countries that other countries are probably not really wanting to work with either. I think the most analogous example you can probably point to at this particular point in time with this current economic climate or geopolitical climate is India. India is trying its best to thread the needle between not pissing off the United States, but also wanting to work with China and Russia as well. they're not explicitly anti-Western, which is kind of interesting given their deep history with British colonialism. But they are also not necessarily against, and they in fact see themselves as benefiting from a potential multipolar world. But they're not the ones pushing it.
I think what you get to is, by the way, Russia very much wants a multipolar world, as long as they're one of the poles.
As long as they're one of the poles,
and
exactly.
And what, the bipolar world of the Cold War was ending was a shock to them, and what they felt in the 90s was they no longer mattered.
Yeah,
Russia needs to matter, and when the United States, for example, did what it did in Kosovo in 98, or in 2003 in Iraq. Don't forget, in 2002, the Russians opened up their bases in Central Asia and really helped facilitate what NATO did in Afghanistan. Russia wants to matter. They want to be consulted on it. And they're going to play every side to make that happen for them.
Yep, exactly. So I think that just about wraps up the discussion. I will say that the Russian attitude is probably going to be something more along the lines of the dude abides, as opposed to being a more explicitly confrontational sort of thing. I mean, you can probably think of them as saying something along the lines of, dude, come on, you're being very undude right now. And that's about the extent of riled up you'll see in the alternate timeline. Dylan wanted us to throw in these references, so I'll
allow that, but like within reason.
Within reason. Yes, within reason. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and listening along with us. If you enjoyed this, feel free to sound off in our Discord and let us know other thoughts around the Spotify comment section. We read them all and greatly value and appreciate your time. As we always like to end off these episodes, if there is a fork in the road of time, what do you think we should do with that?
Take it.
Take it. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.